Apex predator, high on cocaine, out of its mind. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is the 10th episode of season 7, and we are discussing the newly released film, Cocaine Bear. All right, Mel could not be with us, sadly, with this episode, but we thought we would take a little bit advantage of her absence and watch a movie that she would probably hate. So we chose the movie Cocaine Bear. So a little bit about the film. It was written by Jimmy Warden, and it was directed by Elizabeth Banks. So Elizabeth Banks, you probably recognize that name. She's an actress. I think that's what most people know her from. She's also directed a few things, but she's much more well-known, I think, as an actress. This movie stars a lot of big names: Kerry Russell, Ray Liotta, Margot Martindale. Matthew Rhys makes a fun little cameo, I guess you'd call it, in the film. Jesse Tyler Ferguson. And it was the first film for Scott Seiss, who I guess you'd classify him as a comedian. I've seen him on online doing some funny videos on like Twitter and TikTok, that sort of Instagram. Anyway, he's pretty funny, and he was a perfect addition to this film. But Cocaine Bear I think it's what we would classify as a B movie. It feels in the same vein as I thought immediately after I saw it of the movie Piranha 3D that came out. It's kind of one of these like self-aware, overly gory, kind of hybrid horror comedies that really kind of leans into the B movie aspect. And I think this one in particular does it really successfully, but I'm sure, talk about that. So the story itself is about a bear that finds some cocaine in the woods and eats it, and then goes on a killing rampage. It says it's based on a true story, and it is, although it takes a lot of creative license. So the real story was in the 1980s, I believe in 1985. It actually has connections to Tennessee and Georgia. So listeners, you probably know from the way we speak that Matt, Mel, and I are all Southerners. We all live in the South. I'm in Tennessee right now. So, I got to have a little bit of state pride reading this story. But apparently what had happened is there was a drug smuggler. His name was Andrew Thornton. In the film, he's played by Matthew Rhys, and the film opens on him. And I believe he was flying the plane from Colombia. It was a small plane, but he was over Tennessee, and I guess the plane was carrying too heavy of a load. And he was parachuting out of it. No, I don't know fully why. This was in September of 1985. But something happened, and his parachute didn't fully open. Long story short, he landed in the yard of a man who lived in Knoxville, Tennessee. They found him dead, and the FBI began this investigation of what had happened, and they found out that this was this convicted drug smuggler that they had been looking for. The only problem is it wasn't just him who dropped from the plane. Also, his stash of cocaine dropped from the plane. So they found some of it with him in Tennessee, but quite a bit of it made its way, because Knoxville, for those of you who don't know, is pretty close. It's in eastern Tennessee. It's pretty close to the Smoky Mountains. And so, of course, just over the Smoky Mountains is Georgia. And they found some of it in the Chattahoochee National Park. And that is where they also found the bear. So apparently, it was a 175-pound black bear that had an overdose on the cocaine. I guess he had discovered the drug and died. This was in December when they found the dead bear. So it is a sad story from that point of view, but it's an absolutely like true story. And they did find this bear along with the drugs. Now, that's the real story. The movie, like I said, kind of takes it into B movie territory, and there's a lot more blood and gore and death and dismemberment that happens. So I don't really think you can spoil this movie, because I feel like just seeing the poster, just seeing the name, just knowing what happened, you probably can imagine the movie. And listeners, I'm telling you, like, whatever movie you're imagining is probably the one we saw. But here is your warning: we will be talking about the movie in depth, and we will be spoiling it. We're going to try to keep it, like we do, a little bit more PG. But with something like this, it may be a little bit difficult. So let's go ahead and put a little warning on that. The last thing I'll say about this, before we really get into the talking about the film, is that it has grossed, as of today, which is March 8th, it has grossed $43.7 million, or $43.7 million in the United States and Canada, a worldwide total of 55.6 million. So, I mean, I don't know much about box office numbers, but I would say that's pretty good for this type of film. With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Matt. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this movie.
Well, going into this movie, I was hopeful that I would like it. It sounded like it was just straight up my alley, just based on the little that I had read about it. I tried to keep myself kind of in the dark, and I don't watch a lot of TV, and so I don't see a lot of trailers or anything unless I like deliberately look for them. So I hadn't even really seen but maybe one teaser trailer for it, and I have to say I was not disappointed in the slightest. I mean, like you said, it's if you imagine a movie, a kind of horror comedy about a bear going on a murderous cocaine-fueled killing spree, it's probably going to be pretty close to the movie that got made. It's funny in places. It's over the top gory in other places. It's a lot of fun. I think it's only about an hour and a half too, so it's a real tight runtime. You're not looking at a 3 hours Avengers movie or something like that. It knows what it is, and it knows what it's trying to do, and it doesn't try to do too much else. And I think looking at the tagline on IMDb is actually a pretty good synopsis. An oddball group of cops, criminals, tourists, and teens converge on a Georgia forest where a huge black bear goes on a murderous rampage after unintentionally ingesting cocaine. I think that is what that movie was. But I have to say, I mean, the actors in it, I mean, you mentioned several of them, but I also want to just give a shout out to the O'Shea Jackson Jr., which, if you don't recognize that name, he's best known for playing his father, O'Shea Jackson, better known as Ice Cube in Straight Outta Compton. So, Ice Cube's son is one of the main actors in this, and he was one of my favorite characters. Actually, he was one of the drug dealers. I just really liked his character, but really. It's almost kind of an ensemble comedy, if you will. Well, I don't want to say comedy because it really does embrace the horror as well. But I mean, it's an ensemble cast, and I think that if anything, that could be the one possible kind of flaw is that some of the characters, like, I felt like I would have liked to have spent a little more time with some of the characters, if that makes sense. I would have been okay with the movie being a little bit longer, but that's a light criticism. I loved it. I mean, I walked out of the theater and was just so happy that I had seen it. And so that's kind of my, I guess, initial impressions. So, kudos to Elizabeth Banks. She did a heck of a job directing this. So, yeah, like that's kind of my initial impressions, at least. What were your thoughts on like fresh out of the theater? Uh,
um, well, I do want to say I did just look it up out of curiosity because I gave you the box office numbers and I said I wasn't really sure what they meant. This movie, its opening weekend was number 2 in theaters, only behind Ant-Man, and then in the second weekend was number 3, and that was, of course, due to Ant-Man and then Creed. So, I think for this type of movie, that's absolutely incredible. Um, yeah, I agree with you that I don't know if I would necessarily like classify this as a comedy. I don't know what I would classify it as, except like, like, I mean, it is a comedy horror, but only in this sense, I feel like that this is one of those movies that pushes the like horror aspects to the point of kind of making you squirm in your seat. There are a couple of moments that I can think of that made me do that. Not just with the gore. The gore was over the top, and if you're somebody who enjoys, which probably if you're listening to this podcast, then you're probably like me and probably like Matt. I would imagine you are. I enjoy watching gore on the screen. I think that's part of the fun of watching a movie like this is getting, especially when it's presented as, yes, it's real, but it's almost in a, like, it is almost in an over the top, like you're gonna see a guy not only get like pulled apart, but you're gonna see his leg like go flying comically through the forest. I mean, it almost harkens back to things that Matt, like I know you and I really enjoy, like the Evil Dead movies, for instance, those kind of things. But it also kind of pushes you to like the point of being squeamish and showing something for not just like a beat too long, but for a good 2-3 minutes too long. And really kind of that kind of gross out factor. Um, Also because this does have so many different plot and storylines that the characters. Now I'm going to go back to what you said about the characters real quick, but before I do that, like there are children in this film, and any time that I think you put children in danger, but then there's also like it's a movie about drugs, that's also something that's super uncomfortable. And this film also manages to like make you sit in that discomfort and again kind of get a little squeamish, but also make you laugh, which I think you mentioned like how well I think Elizabeth Banks did directing this. I think that speaks a lot to the director and kind of the timing and the editing and all that of the film too. That was so well done. But going back to what you said about the characters, Matt, I was surprised at how like close I felt to a lot of the characters in particular. So I guess the two main groups that you were really following, the two main plots, there were the kids who I mentioned. So there was a mother, she's a nurse, she's single, she's like played kind of overwhelmed, but very loving, played by Carrie Russell. I think she did great. She's got a daughter named Dee Dee who decides to skip school with her friend Henry because they want to go paint a picture of, there's this like falls out in the forest, and her mom had like, I guess, like promised she'd take her, and then the mom can't because she's working, and so they just decide to skip school and go out into the woods. And so when her mom realizes she's gone, she goes into the woods to get them. So you've got these kind of lost kids and the mother going to find her daughter. Um, but then you also have the kind of drug dealer aspect. And Matt, like you mentioned, O'Shea Jackson Jr., you're absolutely right in calling him out. I forget every time until I see him on screen again, like how talented he actually is. He was in that film, Ingrid Goes West. I love that movie. And I loved him in it. I loved him in this. So I was so glad to see him in this. But he plays, I guess, kind of, I don't know what he would be. But he's kind of he's a worker for Sid, who is one of the main like drug guys, who's played by Ray Liotta, and he sends David, who is O'Shea Jackson Jr.'s character, and his son Eddie, Sid's son Eddie, to go into like the woods in Georgia to go recover the drugs that have been lost there, because he's basically saying like, I'm in deep with a bunch of people and they're mean and they're going to come and hurt us and hurt my family if we don't, somehow either recover the money or the drugs. So you've got to go get this, because this is millions of dollars in the woods that have been lost. So they're going also into the woods at the same time that this bear is out there. So what's really, I thought, interesting is Eddie, who's out there. Um, he's been depressed because his wife has died from cancer. I mean, he's been having a really hard time. There's talks about like he had kind of abandoned his son, or like left his son with his father, because he can't parent him because of the depression. And then he also wants to get away from his father's drug business, because his wife really, she wanted him out. She thought it was dangerous for their family. And so there's that kind of family dynamic. I was not expecting, especially in the beginning, they kind of play up Eddie to be a comic character. Like, even though he's depressed and he's like, his wife has died and he shouldn't be played up as a comedic character, like they're kind of playing him up that way. I wasn't expecting by the end to like be rooting for both Eddie and David, who are also the bad guys essentially. And they're at least working for the bad guys in the film. And like rooting for the way their friendship developed over the course of this. I wasn't expecting that. Like, I mean, you're going to be rooting for the mom to find her two kids, but I was surprised that I was rooting for them as much as I did. So I was surprised by that. I would have liked to have spent more time with all of the characters, but I was surprised that we got as much character development as we did, given the kind of movie that it is, where usually these characters are only introduced to be collateral. They're kind of these paper character cutout characters that are just put up so that they can be knocked down by the cocaine bear. And I was surprised that like I was as invested as I was in them, and they were a joy to watch on screen. So that really shocked me.
Yeah, I felt the same way, especially about David and Eddie. Their relationship, and it's not like they didn't know each other before the movie started, but it seemed like they had kind of had a falling out since David stayed in the drug business after Eddie got out, and so there was some distance there between them. But the real interesting thing, I can't really describe it other than kind of both of them. There's kind of this trope that you see in some movies where it's like the reluctant drug dealer or like the good guy in a bad profession. And that's kind of what both of these characters were. But they did it in a like in a good way. It wasn't ham-fisted. It wasn't a stereotype. You really were, like you said, by the end of the movie, you really are rooting for David and Eddie to get away and not just survive the cocaine bear, but to escape from Sid's out from under his thumb, even. So yeah, I don't know really how else to explain it other than kind of the good guy and the bad profession sort of thing. But the movie did, like you said, a really good job of making them not not one-dimensional characters, and I really liked that. And just as a side note too, I have to say, probably to me, one of the funniest things in the movie has to do with Eddie when we first see him because and this is gonna be a slight spoiler, listeners, so, w but I have to share it because I thought it was just hilarious. David catches up with him in a bar, and Eddie is, like, sadly drinking, and he shows David the tattoo that he just got of his wife's name in a heart, Joan, except the tattoo artist had screwed it up and it said John. And I thought that was hilarious, especially because he's like, "Well, can't you get it fixed?" And he's like, "Yeah, but I have to wait a week for it to heal before they'll fix it." And so that kind of like there's a callback to that later in the movie, which I thought was great. But I don't know, it was just a subtle one-off kind of joke that was really funny to me. But it also like it showed their relationship a bit too, because David like cares enough to be like, well, I mean, we can get it fixed. And then again, they reference it later at the like towards the end of the film. So but yeah, like as far as the characters go too, to kind of branch away from Eddie and David for a minute, I also found the park ranger and I guess he was the kind of the wildlife. I can't remember exactly what they called him, but I found those characters to be just absolutely great. It was Jesse Tyler Ferguson from Modern Family is what he's most well known, and Margot Martindale, which she was actually on the second season of Justified, and I believe she actually won an Emmy for her role in that uh, season because she was just fantastic. But she's a park ranger who is smitten with this guy who is completely clueless about her, and he is just like very self-involved hippie. And I found that like the kind of back and forth with the two of them to be just really fun and great as well. They made for some good comic relief. They well, I don't know how much we want to avoid spoilers, but they may not have survived the wrath of Cocaine Bear, but um, yeah, I really liked them. Were there any other characters that jumped out for you?
Oh yeah, I mean Margot Martindale's uh, Ranger, I think was perfect. And I agree that she's one of those characters who, I mean, she anytime you see her appear on your screen, you're in for something fun. And I felt like fully fleshed out that Ranger character as much as she could. Again, spoilers, the Ranger isn't around for long. We'll leave it for you to kind of watch the film, I guess, and discover what happens. But I felt like she played the Ranger who was in love with this, like, yeah, I guess he was like a wildlife protector guy. He I don't know what I don't even know what his name was in the film. I can't remember it. Peter, maybe. She's smitten with him, and her whole kind of obsession with him is funny, and it is played for comedy. But at the same time, I don't feel like she plays her character as a stereotype. And I think that's something that you had mentioned, that even the characters that are funny here and that do kind of go towards stereotype, I don't feel like you're laughing at them because of the characters they're playing or the stereotypes they're playing. I think you're laughing at the absurdity of the situation, if that makes sense. And that's a big distinction, because sometimes it can feel mean. Like, that's one thing that I mean, and I guess it's with any genre, but with comedy especially, I get really sensitive when I feel like, okay, I'm supposed to like care for this character on the screen, but you're making me like laugh at them. And um, in a way that feels kind of mean and cruel. And I didn't feel like that with these characters. I mean, sometimes they were stereotypes. I mean, like the hikers, for instance. It was Olaf and Elsa. They were these like European honeymooners who were hiking through the woods. And I mean, they were played up as kind of stereotypes. And, you know, of course, they're not in the film very long either. So you can guess what happens to them. But I still didn't feel like I was laughing at them, if that makes sense. And feel like she was the same way. So I did appreciate that. I think that's a really fine line to walk when you're dealing with this kind of comedy. I mean, it is kind of the same thing with horror. Like, we want to see the blood and guts and gore, and you see all of that in the film, but you want to see it in a fun way, or at least I do. I don't want to see it in like a voyeuristic um mean way, and I didn't feel like this was that. It felt, it still felt fun to me as you're watching it, which is a really weird thing to say. I will also say there were some really tense moments in this. You know, there were moments where, like the bear at one point was locked away in the ranger's office, and you know where the bear is, and so that's kind of a scary moment. There's a really tense moment where the bear essentially passes out, and they're just kind of, you know, trying to figure out how to get away. um there's there was a really tense moment with an ambulance. I will say that. It did. They had a pretty impressive ambulance scene, that I don't want to spoil, but it went to gorier places than I thought it would. I think at that point I actually closed my eyes. So, but yeah, I don't know. I really want to see more. I want to see more of this kind of film. I don't know what we would classify it as. I know we keep like dancing around what it is. The best way I can describe it is like a funhouse carnival of a horror movie. That's the feeling of it, and that's what I want. That kind of B movie, but done well enough that it could be like it's done in the production style of an A-level movie, even though it's definitely a B horror movie, and it just has that like carnivalesque funhouse tone that I adore.
I mean, I think that's a good way of describing it because I mean, it's hard to find a comparison because it's such a niche genre of movies, and even in that genre, it's fairly limited, the ones that are actually good. Um, I mean, I think like we said at the top of the show, it's a show that or it's a movie that knows what it is, and it's not trying to be anything more than what it is. And it sort of leans into that aspect. So I mean, yes, there are humorous moments. There are some definitely horror moments, but it's also, like you said, very B movie without being overly camp. I mean, it's kind of like a B movie with enough budget to have a decent production value out of it. I mean, the closest I could probably think to compare it to might be Snakes on a Plane, or possibly Shaun of the Dead. Although Shaun of the Dead is very different in terms of its tone. It's clearly a satire, and this isn't a satire. But I think Shaun of the Dead really went into the gore side of things because it's a zombie movie in the same way that this did because it's sort of a animal on the loose uh, movie slash slight slasher movie. I would even say, in a way, if the slasher is just a bear on coke. Um, yeah, it's. I mean, I don't know really besides those two if I could really find any others that even fit within the genre that it is. So it's such a niche thing, but it really succeeds in my opinion. I mean, this is a movie that I feel like I'm probably going to purchase it when it's available, and I'm going to watch it multiple times. It's really a lot of fun to watch with friends. I was telling Lisa this before we started recording, that I was talking about going to see this this weekend for the podcast because we had decided to do it, and my wife was like, "Well, I want to see it," and then our kids said, "Well, we want to see it," and then I actually ended up texting a friend of mine, and he and his girlfriend came, and so we made a big outing out of it, and it's really the kind of movie to watch with a lot of people and to just sit and laugh at. And also go, oh, at Dead Alive. That would be another movie that I think would fit kind of in the same genre. It's got the horror, it's got the comedy. Um, yeah, that might be one other movie that might fit there. But yeah, I mean, it's really especially something that I think is like a lot of fun to watch. I could watch it by myself. I could watch it with other people. Um, it's got a lot of replay value, and it's got some great quotes and some great scenes and some fun acting in it.
I I completely agree. With everything you said, and I think if we're going to find a good comparison, I think Dead Alive might be kind of the perfect companion piece, because really um, when we're talking about B level horror movies, um, it's it's something that I think we tend, or at least I tend to think of like Roger Corman type films, and we watched a lot of those when we did some of the like shark movies for our shark summer. And that were, we kind of laughed, are they like so bad that they're good, or are they bad? This one is a good movie. And, somebody like Roger Corman, for instance, he's very famous for saying he makes movies for under $1 million because he doesn't believe you should make a movie for more than that. I mean, that's what he works with. He is very low budget. And I think that's what most people would consider the very bottom of like a low budget film would be $1 million. Anything other than that is really going to be like a micro budget. Um, but even when you look at Dead Alive, so I was curious when I was thinking about this, it had a budget of $3 million. That was back in 1992, which today with inflation is probably like 6.5 million. Cocaine Bear was made for 30 to 35 million. So if that tells you anything kind of about the production value of the film, and you can see that. I mean, they went out to make a good film. I think the difference was they just knew what kind of film they were making, and they stuck to the tone beautifully. So this is not, listeners, a like so bad it's good. This is so good it's good, but it knows it's bad. I know that's so circular to say, but like, just go with it. It's fun. It's one of those movies that you do want to see with friends. And yes, I agree with you, Matt. I will be watching it multiple times too. Listeners, there's so much more I want to talk about with Cocaine Bear, and there's specific scenes that I would love to dissect and really get into. But I do want to avoid the big spoilers because some of it is fun. And I feel like you will lose a little bit of that cringe factor if you know how something's going to turn out. Because there are several things that could go either way. And they kind of play with that tension in a really fun way. So I don't want to go too deep into that. So I think we're just going to call it here. I will say I really enjoyed Cocaine Bear. I can tell Matt did too. I can say confidently that this is not Mel's kind of movie. So Mel, while we did miss you, we're kind of glad that we got to talk Cocaine Bear. Just a little bit to let you know what is coming up. We're going to use this as kind of a kickoff for our next series, which will be about animals in horror movies. So we hope that you join us for that. But you know what? If you have seen Cocaine Bear, or if you're going to see Cocaine Bear, we'd love to know what you think about it. Of course, we're on social media. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. So we'd love it if you would drop us a little line about what your thoughts are on the film, or maybe ahead of our series, your favorite animal in horror. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. We've paused the mini episodes right now, but we do have about 6 seasons of backlog for you to go through. So I think that's a great resource if it's something that you're looking for more content. Of course, if that's not something you can do right now, we understand not everybody can afford to donate money. One thing that you can do that is entirely free is just rate and review us. So, right now, whatever you're listening on, whatever app you're going through, just stop, give us a little 5-star rating, maybe write us a little nice note. That does absolutely help us. It helps other listeners find us, and it kind of boosts us up a little bit in that algorithm. So we very much appreciate it. Theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.